So court surfaces in tennis has a huge impact on the physical load on players at every level. And we know there are a handful of different types of surfaces. You've got the softer surfaces like clay, that have a little less shock, when someone puts force into the ground, but they also have more pressure per square inch over time. So it dissipates a little bit more. So that's a little bit easier on aspects of force, on joints specifically. But then you have the hard courts, which you obviously put more force on less of a distance into the ground, and that creates some challenges for people when they're training a lot. So you have to be a little more careful about training on hard courts for extended periods of time because the loads are higher. So those are the two broad surface categories. Then you have some in betweens like grass doesn't, not many people play on grass anymore, but obviously that's a little bit easier on the body, but there's more slip and fall risk on grass because of how slick it is. But in general, most people now we're talking about clay type surfaces and hardcore type surfaces. And we know injury rates are a bit different on those surfaces. We know that you can typically spend more time on a clay court than on a hard court with less wear and tear on the body. But the training does need to be different because we have more sliding on clay, which impacts the adductor muscles or your groin muscles more. There's potentially more balls being hit as well. So that may impact wrist a little bit more, because you're having to hit more balls with more spin many times. So there's some things there that have to be taken into account with training load. And then also, cardiovascular endurance is usually required a little bit to be higher when we're playing on clay because points in general are 20 to 30% longer. So those are the things to think about when you're talking about preparations for the different surfaces. Yeah, so court surfaces do have slightly different injury profiles. Obviously, playing tennis, you have the same load, same types of loading, forehands, backhands, serves, movement. But on clay courts, we see a lot more sliding. So there's a lot more issues with groins. So you have to strengthen the groin significantly more, because of the distance that someone may slide and the lack of comfort doing that, especially if people have grown up on hard courts. It's difficult sometimes to transition to clay, and the sliding makes it difficult. And they're also using muscles and movements of those muscles in directions that they're not used to. So they may get more injured in those. And we see that, especially when players, especially junior players or even adult players that haven't played much on clay, go over and try to then compete on clay. There's some different pain spots and different injury spots. On hard courts, we usually see lower back being a major concern area. That's usually number one. Then we have knee, depending on the age, but knee is a real concern in junior players, especially. And that's on clay and hard because of the growth related issues. But in general, you see more bothersome issues on the hard courts. So taking care of the knee, making sure our hamstrings are strong, making sure we have good range of motion and flexibility in our hip flexors and our quads are really, really important to help prevent some of that. And making sure our hips are strong. Because if our hips are strong, it takes some pressure off the knees where the load goes. So, and then when we're talking about upper body issues, on clay courts, you're hitting a lot more balls usually. So, wrist, elbow, and even shoulder become problematic for many players if their technique's not good. So, you got to be careful, especially about wrist, because they're hitting more spin usually. They're trying to generate more spin, and many players just default to overusing the wrist to generate the spin rather than using their whole kinetic chain and their entire body. So you got to prepare the wrist even more when you transition, say, from hardcore to clay. And then just understanding that people usually get a little bit more fatigued from a cardiovascular standpoint when they play on clay because points are longer. And we know there is a relationship between fatigue and injury rates. So towards end of matches, when people are playing multiple matches in a tournament, you just have to have really good shape physically to handle playing sort of that extra 20 to 30% of points that are longer on clay than hard court. So making sure that you've really trained for that is really valuable when we're talking about clay specifically. So when we're talking about training, strength and conditioning training for tennis, there's a lot of similarities between training for clay and training for hardcore. It's still tennis. You still got to hit your ground strokes and your serves and your movement, but there are some real differences. One is you got to learn how to decelerate more explosively, so decelerate quicker on hardcore than on clay, because your feet, the way your feet land, the force into the ground is higher, and the need to shift and change direction, agility, think of it from that standpoint, requires a more forceful change of direction on hard court. On clay court, you're usually sliding into the change of directions more. There's a little bit more give or forgiveness in the surface. So you don't have to train as much for that from an injury prevention standpoint specifically. So that's an important distinction. The difference though on clay is you do have to train much more for more lateral type movements with your lower body because you're covering a wider movement per step. And really that's due to the sliding. So the groin, the adductor muscles have to be trained significantly. You have to make sure that also internal hip rotators are important on both surfaces. But on clay, because we rotate a little bit more off our ground strokes usually, we come off the ground more. There's a little bit more lower body involvement many times in the ground strokes on clay. You have to be able to have that range of motion through the hips. So spending time on internal hip rotation, range of motion is really, really valuable. And then making sure that you've got your decelerators working on both surfaces, really, being able to decelerate the lower body. So that's the stopping part of your movements. And then the upper body, especially when you're trying to generate more racket head speed. Nowadays, people are trying to generate racket head speed on both surfaces. So there's not a lot of difference there. But we do have to strengthen our decelerators of the upper body. So our rhomboids, our back posterior side of the shoulder is really important. So pulling movements, rowing movements, really making sure that that's part of the program. But in general, we do a lot of deceleration injury prevention work for the upper body. And then we do, as well as injury prevention for the lower body, we do a lot of various lunge movements in different directions, sliding movements, utilizing the groin muscles, so strengthening those. So variations on, if you've ever heard of Copenhagen's or isometric adductor exercises, those are really, really good to try to get some endurance in those muscle groups. So that's a really important focus when we're talking about training off court for clay and for hard court. The last piece is make sure you get yourself in great physical shape, which a lot of players aren't in, unfortunately, so that they actually don't have a high VO2 max. So we want a VO2 max for guys. If you're past puberty, you want to be above 50 easily. Ideally, closer to 60 really would be good for most high competitive collegiate professional level players. If you're an adult recreational player, anything, if you're a male, if you're anywhere between 25 and 50, if your VO2 is somewhere above 45, you're doing really well. Obviously, getting in the 50s would be great. On the women's side, you usually want to be about 10 mils per kilogram per minute. So that's the metric, is milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute of exercise. You want to be about 10 below what the guys are. That's usually the ratio there. So that's just something to think about. So playing on different surfaces is really important for junior players, especially if they're trying to play at a high level, collegiate, professionally, things like that, because learning the game on those surfaces creates a different style of player. A fast hard court is going to result in usually bigger strokes, focus on shorter points, focus on more aggressive mindset, whereas learning on clay, you typically have to strategize more. You have to play points one or two shots ahead. You have to move in different ways. You have to learn defense usually first before you learn offense. Whereas on hard courts, you can usually get to offense earlier. So that's where the benefit of playing on both surfaces as you're growing up is really valuable because they're different skills and they're both important. Hardcore tennis is a little faster usually, clay court tennis is a little bit slower, but they teach skills that are valuable on both surfaces. So we typically recommend playing a little bit more on clay if you can, if you've got access to it, because the skills developed at a young age on clay can transfer for the rest of your career, and you can pick up the aggressive aspects a little bit later because you're stronger, the ball comes off your racket faster, things like that. It's a little bit harder to learn heavy defense later if you've been a very offensive player. Yeah, so the biggest difference in the surfaces when it comes to biomechanical movement patterns is really the length of steps. That's one of the big differences, and the uncertainty of the footing on clay. So when we say uncertainty of footing, meaning that when you take a step, there is a little bit of movement. Even if you're not trying to slide, there is still a shifting of the surface underneath your feet. So that creates a little instability. That creates a little bit more distance per step that you take. And training for that is really, really important. So you always want to make sure that that's being developed and the stability through the hips becomes really important on clay from that standpoint because you don't always know how sure your footing is. But then on hard courts, the biomechanical aspects of training need to be a lot of landing and sticking and really making sure that when you do land, that you have very little movement. So you have great stability through the hip, through the knee, through the ankle, because we know on hard courts, the force production's higher and we have to handle that force production through better mechanics. So there's definitely a difference in how you train biomechanically for the surfaces. Both from a performance standpoint, how do we move faster? How do we change direction quicker? How do we, deal with those things? But even more important is there are the injury risk issues in both surfaces that are a bit different, and you can offset that by training the right way and making sure that adapt those patterns early on so that players can improve through that so that they can offset any of the potential challenges with moving on either surface. So when you're talking about recovery from the surfaces, hard court versus a clay court from a recovery standpoint, we definitely see differences. So, usually on clay, because of the stretching or the need for a bit more flexibility in movements, especially, we see, that type of soreness, which is more a flexibility driven soreness, because the forces are a bit lower. Whereas on hard courts, we see a lot more short, sharp changes of direction, which is in heavy eccentric load. And the heavy eccentric load that hard courts produce is a higher, usually, percentage of what causes DOMS or delayed onset muscle soreness. It's that unaccustomed eccentric exercise. And on hard courts, we have a little bit more of that because of the forces that are produced on that eccentric load. So we usually see a little bit more soreness after playing a equivalent match on a hard court versus a clay court, assuming people haven't prepared for it. So if they've just come off and you do one match as a test on hard court and a one match test on clay, you'll usually see a little bit more DOMs and soreness off the hard court because of the higher eccentric loads of the change of direction. However, on the clay courts, you'll usually see a little bit more tightness, let's say, in the adductors, sometimes in the calves. We sometimes in the rotation. A lot of people early on when they're playing on clay feel like their trunk and their abs and their obliques are a little sore because they're rotating more than they're used to when they're hitting their ground strokes because they're coming off the ground a bit more. So that's somewhat common. And then we see forearm stuff. So on clay, you sometimes see their forearms start to get a little heavier, little sorer because they're hitting more balls. They're not as used to that. So you have to really address the forearm, the elbow, the wrist area. So that's some of the areas that we see happen more. And then from a recovery standpoint, the same general recovery techniques are recommended. Making sure that you stretch out well after matches, you hydrate and get your fueling, especially protein, in as soon as you can to when you finish your match. And then do some things that heat the muscles up later in the day to get blood flow to that. The more heat you really utilize, the more we get oxygenated blood to the working muscles, and we shift out the deoxygenated blood that we want to move out, so the stagnant blood. So those are some simple strategies. Obviously, there's very more advanced ways to do that, whether it's massage, whether it's electrical muscle stimulation, whether it's other techniques, pneumatic compression devices that pump blood in and out. All of them are generally using the same principle, which is let's move good oxygenated blood to the working muscles to help them heal faster, and let's move out the stagnant or deoxygenated blood back to so that we replace it with better quality, higher quality, useful blood for that purpose. So those are some strategies that can help when we're trying to recover from playing on the different surfaces. Yeah, from a coaching standpoint, understanding some of these aspects we've talked about on the different surfaces, clay versus hard, can really help prepare a player to offset some of the challenges with playing on the different surfaces, specifically from an injury prevention standpoint. Developing the body, strengthening the areas that we've most talked about is really, really valuable. Making sure that you don't overdo the volume when you're shifting surfaces is really important. Making sure that we prepare usually for a week or two before we shift to a tournament on a different surfaces so the body can adapt and adjust to, say, from hard court to clay, sliding more, learning how to really engage the adductors better, making sure our hips are strong. All those things are really, really valuable to try to make sure that you offset any of the challenges that occur with changing surfaces, and developing an athlete, an all-around athlete at a young age specifically, that can handle hard court tennis and clay court tennis just as easily.